It's a great pleasure to have a Greek speaker with us, obviously, Mediterranean Garden Society founded in Greece. Members will remember that Thomas's aunt was president from 2004 to 2007, and we visited her on her glorious garden on Corfu in 2019. Thomas was born and grew up in Athens in an ambitious and intellectual family, so he was likely to seek out one of the best and most prestigious establishments for furthering his education, and he went to America to study at Harvard in 1989. He knew from an early age that he wanted to be an architect, but while he was at Harvard, he got a chance to look over it and see what the landscape architects were doing, and it all looked like much more fun. So having qualified with one master's, he took a second master's, this time in landscape architecture. He now leads Doxiadis Plus, which is a team of over 20 architects in one of the most prominent and pioneering Greek firms working internationally. Projects range from huge commercial to residential, from urban spaces to parks to landscapes and to artscapes. And last year, possibly your smallest ever project, was the one that I found most fascinating, a sort of 40 square meter garden made entirely of mushrooms for the Venice Biennale 2021, entitled Entangled Kingdom. I think it demonstrates perfectly the thread that links all of this work: respect for every form of life, the recognition of our interconnectedness, and the search for a symbiotic coexistence for humans, nature, and every living organism. Thomas, thank you so much for taking time out of your frantic schedule to speak to us. If you would like to share your screen now, and we can begin with your presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'd like to say hello to everyone, and thank you for being here tonight or this morning, depending on where you are. Excuse a bit of an allergy that, decided to develop the last few hours, making me look a bit, like an older tree, let's say, but that's fun as well. Thank you so much, Angela, for arranging this and for inviting me. It's a true pleasure. I've had the pleasure to be not involved, but sort of indirectly involved in the MGH almost since, having met Jai Kitirouid as a very young boy, all the way to today. And in a way, I think that the sensitivity and sensibility that the MGH represents has certainly influenced me. I'm also very happy to see tonight some very dear friends, including Don and Ian, if I understand well, and Louisa. Hello to you, and hello to everyone else. I will start sharing. Please let me know, Angela, can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Wonderful. So I have to share in a special way, I remember, because I have to make sure that I also share sound. So share sound, there we go. And can you now see my screen?
Yep, thank you.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do is to take us all through, a series of short stories tonight that together may form a larger story or not, but they're parts of a puzzle. I do believe that our lives are, they're made of bits rather than being one unified story, and we try to interconnect these bits. And that's also what we've been doing as an office, trying to connect bits that fascinate us or interest us into a common story. We are, as Angela said, at any time around plus minus 25 people, and we project and practice what we hope is a very professional work, but in fact, this is who we really are in our hearts. Incurable romantics. really hoping that the world can become a better place and that we can play a role in that. I'll start with a bit of my own story. I grew up, I was born in 1970, grew up in Greece, and grew up in a Mediterranean which was still at the time, I would say, pristine. One had the sense that it hadn't changed in thousands of years. And I have these amazing natural and cultural landscapes that have been around for a long time, or at least seem to be. And with the stresses that they go under, and with the ways that they cope with those stresses, and with their great power, but at the same time great sensitivity. So growing up, it was also painful, especially starting in the mid-1980s, to see these places starting to go, and they're going at an increasing rate. And I think it is this realization that this beauty is not really eternal, but actually tended and protected by us, because humanity has, this amazing propensity to destroy what it touches, and very often to destroy what it loves. So we're trying to find a better way of doing things, and we find that sometimes, even people who try to do a good job, if it's not well thought of, it's not a real job indeed. So there's a recurring theme, which is that many of our clients are, rather wealthy people from all over the world that buy lands in relatively pristine places. For example, islands in the Aegean, landscapes that have been, they're cultural and natural places that haven't been touched by contemporary human activity. And this is one such client. She's from Switzerland. She hired a team of Japanese architects and ourselves as the landscape architects to design something that fits with the land. And I know it looks a bit brutal, but in fact, it is a well-designed house. And then our job was to make sure that the building and the landscape become one again. And we did so by a very painstaking process of recording all individual plans, working with contractors to make sure that the line of destruction of the construction site would be minimized, etc. And then planning in a way that the building and the landscape would come together in a very sensitive way. And when we were almost done, both the architects with the design of the house and ourselves with the design of the garden, she said, but I have to make sure, you have to make sure, guys, my designers, that there will be no snakes. Because if there are snakes, I won't come to the house. So I think at that point, she had spent well over, I'd say, 2 million euros if you put in land and construction. She bought this land in a snake-infested area. I mean, it's an area that is known for its vipers. And then she said, I don't want any. So we went into this second very thoughtful project, which is to create a defense line against snakes. So again, going around individual plants and developing ideas of troughs or barriers, and working with special Teflon coatings that wouldn't let the snakes climb. And we actually ended up working with the herpetology department of the University of Athens and getting their feedback. And we're exactly at the point of building one-to-one models and throwing the vipers in there to make sure that the vipers would not be able to enter the house. That she said, it's okay, don't worry about the snakes. And of course, for a second time in this process, we were bewildered. Was it that it would cost her some money to do the one-to-one models, or was it something else? We had no idea, but we went back to the original project, but left with this realization that a lot of people come to places that are like this. And in fact, what they really want is something that looks like this, which is safe, controllable, nature as, almost as a living room. Probably not the people in this crowd, but I can assure you many of the people who appear as clients. So it's taken us years of trying to understand what deep psychology is behind this. And we've started to think that maybe Utopia might have to do something with it. Utopian thinking is in, I have something in my head and I want to see it in the real world. So what is interesting is that Utopia, for the sort of, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, was a garden, the Garden of Eden. And we all know the story, the humans started there, then there was a snake, Eve got interested, Adam wasn't too smart about it, and then they were politely asked to leave. And after that moment, again, the Judeo-Christian center and West has been looking back to the idea of garden as the perfect garden where humans can be together with everything else, both innocuous, it's not dangerous, and it serves our needs. And this isn't only it's not only in the sort of Western tradition, in the Chinese tradition again. For example, in stories like very powerfully the idea that perfection, that Utopia is a garden. It's a place out there in nature, and of course there is the very old Chinese tradition of creating, these symbolic utopias, both in writing and in painting and in gardens themselves, and of course in the paradise in Islam, Jannah, which is again a garden. So I think it's interesting for all of us who love gardens and deal with them, that humanity's idea of the perfect place for a very long time seems to be, and interesting, the inverse starts to happen. So we start to create gardens as images of a utopia, which itself may have been a garden, starting from the ancient Egyptians, who celebrate the taming of nature and the abundance of sort of the agricultural revolution, to Persian and Islamic gardens, where the world is controlled by geometry, because geometry represents the perfection that is sort of the divine world, to the cosmic utopias of the earth, the sky, water, reflection, and even to the medieval garden as a place of escape from the evils of the city into a place which is, all good and all safe. But also, interestingly, again, in the medieval European tradition, also the garden, a place of sort of hedonism, lust, and a kind of liveliness that would otherwise be forbidden culturally at the time, pleasure, sensuality. So in that sense, gardens have embodied cosmic orders and have embodied each culture's idea of what the good is at every one time, all the way to sort of the people's parks developed in Germany and then exploded in the it always embodies, the garden embodies each culture's idea of what is the good. Now, that all sounds wonderful. What could be the problem? I think that the problem is when you put the idea of utopia together with the huge capacity that humans have to change the face of the earth during the Anthropocene. So, back to Eden. Adam and Eve are kicked out, but what happens at that point is that in trying to recreate a perfection, humanity imposes its vision, its mental understanding of perfection onto great edges of the earth. So you have, for example, the Roman agricultural system, which is still visible 2,000 years later in the fields around Florence, for example, to the grand projects of the French gardens of the Enlightenment, which are set out using military technology to encompass ever greater and ever vaster stretches of land, in a way, though, that does not speak of, I would say, a sensitive appreciation of land, but rather speaks of an imposition, of a control. So humanity at this point is happy to strut its stuff and show how much in control of nature it is. So nature used to be out of control. We used to be afraid of it, but now we can control it. And that's sort of brought us to our days and ideas of nature that have changed, so that people expect nature itself to look like a golf park. What many of our clients seem, and these ideas keep evolving, and they evolve into, I would say, stranger and stranger visions about what is the good and what gardens should represent. And together with this, let's say, more philosophical approach, there are these guys, and I know there are many people in the audience who remember this bunch. So these guys are the Dynasty bunch. They appear in the 1980s, and this is the Dynasty House. And what happens at the time, in Greece at least, but I've checked this with many people internationally, is that this house becomes, for a huge swaths of people around the globe, it becomes the house to have and the garden to have. And you start seeing sort of ridiculous little facsimiles of that house, even in little villas on Greek islands. So it really is a kind of, if you put together humanity's capacity to change the face of the earth with these, let's call them, in a fun way, ridiculous ideas of what is the good, then we humans become quite dangerous, not only when we're mining or exploiting or dealing with nuclear power, but even when we're making gardens. And I guess, again, one could say that this is a job not really badly done until one realizes that it's done on this landscape. So it has absolutely nothing to do. It has no respect and understanding. So, you have all of us evolved monkeys almost sort of nonsensically spreading our idea of the good through gardening and landscaping all over the world. Now, the snake, sort of the power of nature and the bits of nature that should not be tamed, have existed in the garden. For example, but not very often. The gardens of the high Italian Renaissance have, they contain death, they contain mystery, they contain sexuality, they contain things that cannot be controlled. But it's actually some very particular moments in the histories of gardens where these things appear, and partly what happened, or maybe the most important thing that happened to humans when we were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, is that we met this guy. So we read some of our clients' reactions to untamed nature and some of their need to have everything under control as fear of death. And we think that these kinds of deep worries have to be taken account of in thinking about the future of gardening and landscapes. And we do think there is a responsibility. This is from Greenaway, but there is some responsibility to bring the idea of decay, of the circles of life, of the fact that we are all part of something bigger back into the garden, and make sure that the garden isn't just about, fighting. It should be about coming to terms with things rather than kind of pushing them off. So we do think as a practice that we need to bring the snakes back into the garden. This is from the Melbourne Botanical Gardens, and Dan Pearson is sitting here for anyone who is interested. So a couple of more things, and some of these came up on a recent trip to Australia, actually recent 5 years ago. One was that we might be partially blind. So when we were in Australia, we realized that in these very arid landscapes, these tiny little things that look completely valueless to us are what used to be the most valuable things for the people who lived here, because they are the water holes. They are where water collects during rain. So what for people in older times used to be an absolute jewel, used to be the heart of their existence, for us, we don't even see it because we don't realize. And suddenly that brought to me the understanding that all of these landscapes that we see in the Mediterranean, that they look beautiful, but in fact we are blind, or at least I'm blind, or was, I'm partly blind, but was totally blind to what they're really doing, which is controlling soil and water, and to the fact that there are small things in these landscapes that we now don't look at very carefully, which are the little cisterns and the places where water collects, that were the absolute life givers of the communities who lived here. So we feel that one of our obligations is to open our eyes and our minds and become as unblinded to the various things that are happening around us as possible. And that's a wonderful thing to consider. The second short thought is a bit more difficult. It is the idea put forward by contemporary thinkers such as Slavoj Žižek, that in fact the most important product, the most prevalent product of our stage of human development is waste. That is what archaeologists and what the next sort of generations will realize represents us. The way we treat waste is we make it someone else's problem. It's not in my backyard, it's in someone else's backyard. I'd say in a way we've been becoming a bit better about it, but at least we've realized in parts of society have realized that it's a problem. And there are very interesting artists who deal with waste. For example, this is the 7 Days of Waste project by, I'm trying to remember the name of the artist, and sorry that I don't right now. But it is people surrounded by 7 days of the waste of what they've been consuming. And we're starting to think, why hasn't this realization that this is what we're making of our world entered the world of gardening and landscaping? Well, why? Because it doesn't look good and it's not pleasant, but is that enough? And we've been kind of racking our brains to find examples where these landscapes of waste have existed, and the only examples I could really think of is a wonderful book by Diana Balmori and Margaret Morton about the gardens of the homeless in pre-Giuliani New York, where waste plays a very important role and creates some rather I'd say culturally significant results. And the final small idea, because I feel the need to explain where we're coming from and how we think before we show what we do. And I think maybe sometimes what we do is the least interesting, and why we do it might be more interesting, especially for a crowd who is in love with gardens and about gardens. So it's the idea of extending citizenship. So we think it's rather wonderful that citizenship has been extended gradually from just land owning males to all men of an empire, to slaves, to women, interestingly, after slaves. And very interestingly, starting in 2012 in New Zealand, to non-human entities. So there are, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, there are more and more non-human entities that are gaining legal status of personhood, moral rights, and the right to be, let's say, to fight for their rights. And we're wondering when this will happen for animals and plants. When will we start to realize that these, all of these are fellows on our brief walk on the earth, and are not enemies or things that we use for our advantage and then just toss away. So these are thoughts that are constantly kind of in our minds and that we're working with, and they lead us, among other things, to some projects, some practice, some things that we actually do. I'd like to talk about I've spent about half of the time talking about ideas and where we come from, and I'd like to spend the other half on three projects that I think more than anything will explain why and how we do things. So the first is the landscapes of cohabitation of Antiparos. It is a place that I first visited in 2001 because an old friend, who's also one of Don and Ian's former students, decided to develop. And he said, Thomas, we're going to take 25 hectares and we're going to build 25 villas, and they're going to be grand and they're going to be wonderful. And I thought, oh my God, this is such a beautiful, pristine landscape. How can we not destroy it? And out of this pain, but at the same time, participation in the project, we started to think of all the ways that not only the forms, but also the processes, the fact that this is a landscape that dries out in the summer, the fact that there are existing ecologies happening, plant communities, etc. How could we make it be, how could so a caveat, these landscapes are former agricultural and pastoral landscapes. So they're landscapes that people used to be able to earn a living on. And now a new economic activity is going on, which is tourism and villas. So people formed the land because of economic activity, but the question is, how can we do it in a way that is symbiotic and not antibiotic, is not something that kills things? So here you have the first 20 of these roughly 25 houses, the very first stage of the development, and the fact that architects, and I have to say superb architects were hired for the task, imagine that buildings will land sensitively on the landscape without touching it. But what we call the ugly truth is that the very process of construction is a destructive process. So of the first stage of the project, everything you see in red are areas which were designated to be destroyed by construction because the construction areas couldn't be smaller. So you have these rather large bits destroyed, and also a lot of new things that have to come into the land, such as roads, desalination plants, parking areas, etc. So we started to develop a set of strategies, and I have to say this project has been going for 21 years now, and we're still, let's say, learning from our mistakes and developing. So the strategies had to do with reading how the wind works on the site, how water works on the site, and how erosion works on the site. So you have the geological formations that in turn create a kind of geography and topography and soils profiles, and then the natural processes of wind, water, and erosion, and plant growth starts to work on them and change them. And then humans come and they build agricultural terraces, and they build xerolithies, and they build buildings, and they start to cultivate the land, or have animals on the land, etc. And then some of the land becomes abandoned and becomes reoccupied by the maquis and the frigana vegetation, and you have this sort of dynamic system constantly changing. And what we thought we would do is we would read this system, we would realize what was there in terms of topography, pesular structures, etc., and we would rebuild what existed and extend, sort of use the same vocabulary to extend the Pesula system and the Xerolithia system, so that eventually all the planting and all the architecture would be part of an overall system rather than individual unrelated things. Unfortunately, the architects sort of bought the idea and went with it all the way to a wonderful Portuguese architect actually designing a house which is a Pesula, an agricultural wall house embedded in the land. And then the next stage is that we start reading the land around and understand what kind of landscape typologies exist or existed in the past, and use it to stitch the house back into the landscape, but by at the same time providing amenities for the inhabitants. Another important strategy is working ever more closely with the construction people to make sure that the destruction on the land is as minimal as possible. So what you would usually see, and I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but I will assume that you can, is that usually they carve a road through the land and then they just dump the excess material under the road. So you have a much larger imposition on the land. So what we work with them to do is to, immediately when they excavate something, to pick it up on a truck and move it further away and reuse it elsewhere in the project. And also to establish very clear lines and minimize the construction areas of each house, so that the existing landscape would be protected to a maximum beyond that. Then again, reading the various landscape typologies, working on strategies that would be acceptable to the owners, but I'll make a quick explanation here. In this case, for example, the land is mainly surrounded by frigana, by wild grasses and former wheat and barley fields, by maquis. And what we've done is we've brought the wild grasses and barley fields on top of a house that is actually built underground as an in-cave house, made a more decorative, let's say, band of beautiful irrigated garrigue, what we're calling cute garrigue, so that the people who are in the house will have, something acceptable to look at. And then going back out into wild unirrigated garrigue and maquis. I will talk about that a bit more later. Or in this case, which is a different house, realizing that the main structure you have on the land are these amazing Pistacia lentiscus blobs, which actually grow almost like bacteria, because they're growing together with their symbiotic fungus. So the mycorrhiza is growing, and the Pistacia lentiscus is growing in these amazing forms, and then taking that idea and making a landscape in a different set of houses, which is based on these kind of blobby islands with the rest of the landscape running in between. Then working with native plants and establishing mixes rather than groups. So trying to imitate in a way a beautiful way that they appear in nature, and really trying to understand what it is that makes these very beautiful rhythms, and realizing that it is neither chaos nor order that we're looking at here. It's something in between. And we actually tried to work with a mathematician at the time to create a model, but that didn't really work out. No mathematician that we could find was interested enough. So we ended up developing our own system, which is based on percentages and mixes where a percentage of a certain plant moves on to the next mix and then to the next mix, but in different percentages, so that you have soft transitions rather than sort of hard, more man-made edges. And we've reached a point now in projects in Portugal that I realize now maybe I should have also talked about, but we don't have that much time to do very careful floristic surveys. And do very precise 4x4 meter records of how, not just which plants are in certain areas, but how they're arranged in space, so that we can then learn from that to do our planting. And then tying this all in different zones, because one of the main issues we had from the beginning is that both the developer and his end clients did not accept the idea of absolute dryness in the summer. So they didn't want something that looked completely natural, that was too harsh and too dead looking for them, back to the fear of death theme. So we ended up developing a system whereby the zones closest to the houses would be well maintained and irrigated. And then the further you go out into the landscape, you have less maintenance and irrigation, and you let it go wild. And an assisting strategy, which is starting with the bits that have been wiped out. So the little pink, purple dots are the bits of nature that have not yet been. I mean, they're existing. Then with the artificially purchased and introduced Mediterranean plants, increasing the distances, the planting distances from plant to plant as you go from the house out to the landscape, so that you have a rather compact, very well controlled and manicured looking Mediterranean planting close to people, which is what they want to look at, but a progressively wilder vegetation going out, where you have natural revegetation, you have emergent vegetation among the plants. And it's a very interesting system, very well thought out of. It failed in the first few years. I'll explain why. And then also identifying plants that we could not find in the trade, really admirable. My own journey has been one of going from loving form and control and architecture and monumentality to falling more and more in love with what is alive and trying to respect it rather than control it. So a lot of very respectable and wonderful plants. We ended up working with a small nursery on the island of Milos to produce them in ever greater varieties. And then the next step has been working with Olivier Philippi and Yorgos and Kalliopi on the island of Milos to do completely dry, completely irrigation-free planting. But completely irrigation-free in Milos, which has 200 millimeters of rain a year, is different from completely free in Mez, which has 600 to 700 millimeters a year. So This has been a very interesting experiment, and we've over the process of 4 years, we've been recording which plants do well and which ones one can actually use in the end for completely irrigation-free planting. And together with that has been a strategy of what gets maintained and what does not, where you let nature redevelop, and where you irrigate and where you don't. So we've been trying to irrigate as little as possible. So a lot of failures that one can sort of be merry about down the line. This is the first house that I showed that has this, from the very beginning, this wonderful idea of the natural and the artificial Mediterranean landscape coming together. And it failed. Why? Because we went the first year after planting, and natural revegetation was happening wonderfully in all of this area, but not in the area which had been planted, which is where we desperately wanted it to happen. So we walked away, we started to get worried. We went back the second year, same problem. Where we needed natural revegetation to happen, it wasn't happening. So the client got impatient. He called the local nursery. He filled it up with plants in the interstices, and it's been like that ever since. So, you know, big failure. And we were trying to realize why these plants refused to grow, and we were wondering if they were using pesticides. And we ended up talking to the guy who was doing the maintenance, and he said, "But of course I'm removing the weeds." So what for us had been we thought a wonderful idea of letting nature regrow, for him was weeds that he knew he had to pull out. So we realized that we in a massive miscommunication between us, the client, and his caretaker. I wouldn't call him gardener necessarily. That taught us sort of the unimportance of design compared with the importance of maintenance and correct communication. A second problem that has developed over the year is that the caretakers tend to over-irrigate, which means that out of an original selection of, let's say, 30 to 50 species, you end up with the 5 species that can tolerate over-irrigation. Everything else dies. And we've been, the way we're dealing with that is establishing for the clients irrigation schedules for the various zones, sort of going down the years. And some clients follow them and some clients don't. So some gardens are doing well and some gardens are not. But all in all, what we've been trying to do is go from what we consider sort of 0% natural or totally artificial to as close to restoration as a garden can get, while at the same time enjoying gardening, enjoying the fact that we're also doing something that is not pure ecological restoration, but needs to communicate, needs to symbolize, needs to give some pleasure. So a few before and after photos, and the interesting bit about the lower photo, which is the after photo, there are already 7 houses built in this photo, and a lot of destruction that has been reintegrated into the landscape. When I showed this first to my father, he said, "Well, what have you done here?" And we thought, fantastic. If you can't tell what we've done here, we've succeeded. And then we've entered these in a number of competitions. Some of them, have been successful, but in one of them, we didn't do well. And one of the jury members was Tom Stewart Smith. And I talked to him afterwards, and he said, "Well, we couldn't really understand what you'd done here. So what we thought was a strength was considered a weakness because of our failure to communicate, of course." So all of these places that, sorry, Angela.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just going to ask, there's one person who is not muted, Cleofe. Could you just make sure you're muted, because he's just interrupting. I don't know how to pronounce your name, but I think it's Cleofe. Please make sure you put your mute on. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. So most people who see these things now, would call them gardens or landscapes, think that they've always been there, but in fact they're the result of quite careful and interesting work, I would say. And that is the first and maybe biggest in terms of learning project that I would like to share, which we call landscapes of cohabitation, symbiosis, because these new uses and new people and the old landscapes are sort of coming together in what we think is a decent sort of level of symbiosis. And of course, our favorite bits are always the ones that are done by nature, I have to say. We can enjoy the fact that we'll never be as good, but we can try. The second comes an even more commercial, I would say, project, which is the Amman Zoe, which is an Amman Resort in Porto Heli, where these various strategies have become, I would say, even more clarified and strategic. So the entire area of the development is about 25 hectares. Within it, the first area of 8 hectares is the hotel, and then there are the villas. I will show bits of both. But again, what we did here is we looked at, in the landscape itself before it was bulldozed, and in the surrounding landscapes, and we identified the main landscape typologies. So the prevalent typology, which is sparse, which is fields, sort of barley and wheat and oat fields that are then also used for grazing, with sparse olives and carobs, dense olive groves, vineyards, pine forests, maquis, garrigue, and we identified these on a map. And then we started to think how they could inform the project. So what we ended up doing is we established, let's say, 5 main typologies, which is the encircling pine forest, which is existing, protected, and we used it as we extended it into the project. The sort of more wild-looking garrigue and frigana, which becomes sort of Mediterranean-type gardens along the main rooms, extensive areas of grasslands, which are again barley fields, but also fields of wild Iparenia and Rhizopsis, the local grasses. Then inspired by the vineyards, and finally another protective layer which closes off the place from the road. And the idea is that as you go from the outside, the wild or the older cultural, to the front of house areas, these landscape typologies become more and more and more controlled and manicured and chic. This project was developed together with Patti Stevens and a wonderful team. All of the work that I'm showing is teamwork, and I'm just happy to be one of the the team members, and not always necessarily even the most active one. But so here you have the various types of plants found in the surrounding countryside, used to various uses, from completely, let's say, wild looking to more controlled, and even in certain cases, I would say, quite manicured looking. What's been interesting in this case, as in the case of Antiparos, is the reception. Because when we started working on Antiparos, people, the clients didn't really understand what we were talking about, and we had to kind of almost fake it to get the things to be built. But then we started to see acceptance. In the Amman Zoe, it was interesting because we had acceptance from Adrian Zeka, who was the very wise old sort of Mr. Miyagi-like Malaysian Chinese gentleman who developed the Amman hotels, who realized immediately that he was on board, because the philosophy of his resorts is that when you are in a place, you should not feel that you are in an Amman resort, you should feel that you're in that place. And we were allowed to do, all the way to planting fields with barley and letting them even maybe not look so great part of the year. And what is great is that we keep getting responses from the hotel operators that the landscape is the number one thing that their guests are happy about and comment positively on. So that is a huge pleasure. They say, "Oh, it's so Greek and it's so beautiful. We don't need to hear anything else. This is the greatest, greatest pleasure and the greatest gift that they could be giving us." So now, leaving slowly with a few nice-looking pictures, the southern Peloponnese, we will come to what, I don't know, Angela, do we have to stop strictly at in 5 minutes, or do we have a bit more time? Yeah. So I guess whoever wants to leave can leave, and then some of us can stay on and talk about things.
Yeah.
Okay. So we don't seem to be leaving the Peloponnese quite yet. There seems to be quite a few pictures. So, and now for something completely different, as the Monty Pythons would say. We got a call the summer of July of 2019 to participate in the 2020 Architectural Biennale in Venice, which is, in the world of architects, sort of the best thing you can be asked to do. We were asked to participate not as representing Greece, but by the curator himself, so to be part of the international exhibit. And what was fascinating is that this curator, the Biennale is an institution, but every 2 years they bring a curator, and the curator sets the theme and invites the participants. And Hashim Sarkis, who is he's currently the Dean of Architecture at MIT, and very interesting person, he set the theme of how will we live together, which is, I mean, it's quite seminal. It's also quite interesting that he set that theme, a few months before the COVID outbreak. So little did we know how important that would be in the coming months. And he identified it in 4 different subcategories. How would we live together as individuals in a smaller scale, the scale of a room or the house? How would we live together as communities in the scale of let's say the scale of a neighborhood? How would we live together across nations, tribes, religions, and other, these other difficult boundaries? And finally, how will we live together on this multi-species planet? How will we live together with all the other species that we've been treating like shit, forgive my French. So he invited us to do a garden, and we were really intent on doing something with fungi, because we consider them one of the unsung heroes of the world we live in. And we started developing the garden. We found out we couldn't really do a fungi garden because fungi are not the organisms, they are the flower. And we wanted to talk about the organism, which is tiny and unimpressive and disgusting for most people. So we decided to take 2 rooms that are, already beautifully infested with fungi and lichen, and we took it upon ourselves to take this, which is what most people find really difficult to deal with, and teach people that without these little organisms we would not exist. They are our our fellow travelers on this planet. They are in fact more important than we are, even though we think we're more important. If they were to disappear tomorrow, believe me, we would not last. We would last very little. And what we wanted to talk about is the idea of entanglement, which is the fact that things are interconnected, not necessarily symbiotic, because you also have relationships that are kind of parasitic or other relationships. Entanglement comes from the world of physics, and it describes systems where things, even though they're not touching, you know, when something changes in one, it changes the other. So they're all kind of working together. And as humanity has been finding out more and more, and I could even say it's become sort of fashion in the last year or two, forests are almost superorganisms. They're not made out of individuals. And one of the things that ties these the trees together, for example, are the mycorrhiza networks. The networks of fungus strands that tie trees together, and in fact can even communicate information among trees in a number of species. But how do you talk about something which is, you know, visible mainly with a microscope, or is really tiny? You know, how do you think in gardening terms? And by garden I mean something made with nature, and talking about nature. I don't mean necessarily, you know, anyone's specific idea of garden. So how can you garden with fungi? So we started doing a number of experiments, from growing mushrooms and working with a nice mushroom grower on the mountain of Dirfi, north of Athens, to eventually realize that what we actually wanted to do was the following. We took the fungi that existed in the space by actually chiseling them off the walls, and by using air traps, which is the device on the left, to capture the spores that are in the space. So we took the actual fungi from the space, and we worked with a wonderful professor from the University of Athens called Zapigonu, who is as crazy or even crazier than us, and as crazy as the snake guys that we used to work with, and who was enthralled by the idea that someone else loves fungi and might actually want to do something with them. So we collected all of these fungi, we started growing them and identifying them and separating them so we could multiply them. And then we started to in the same way that someone would try to understand the plant, you know, pretend you didn't know anything about plants, and you had to start to understand how certain plants act so that you could then kind of play with them. That's what we started doing with the fungi, and doing a lot of experiments with things that looked interesting, but also slightly hideous. I mean, an artist's obligation is, or not obligation, an artist's power is to use aesthetics and to use visual communication to transmit an idea. And the idea that we wanted to transmit are that fungi are beautiful, you know, we should love them. And we weren't quite getting there. We were getting rather disgusting results. And we were also getting a lot of weird things happening. These are very fast growing organisms. They create their own microclimate, you know, they're really difficult to control. So we started playing with different growing media, with different materials, with different fungi in different arrangements, to see how we could learn, you know, really starting from zero to garden with these little creatures. And then it started to become clearer and clearer and better and better. And then we did start to have results that we thought we could communicate to people, and they could say, wow, this is beautiful. I didn't know. Tomorrow I'm going to, or going back home today, when I open my fridge and the yogurt looks like this, I won't immediately throw it into the garbage. You know, I will realize what is going on. And I have to say, this transformation has happened in us as well. We are fascinated now by everything rotting in our fridge, rather than considering it disgusting and throwing it away. So we did all of our preparation. Fortunately, the Biennale was pushed back by an entire year because of COVID and lockdown. We would not have managed to do it if it wasn't for that, because we did need a lot of time to experiment and learn how to do this. We designed the space. We looked for donors. We managed to find a third of the money that we needed. We minimized and pared down and minimized and made our design as minimal as possible. We fabricated our pieces, we prepared our grows, we sent everything to Venice, which arrives in a way much more interesting than it does in other places. We set up shop. We were given a wonderful vault in an old monastery, right? Monastic gardens in close to the Arsenale. And we set up our local lab, and we started to prepare our fungi and set up the space. And basically what we used are the fungi, 2 tables, 1 round dish, lights, and sound. So the first room has this sort of tentacles of rhizomatic mycorrhiza and sounds of nature, and then just pulling you into the next space. And in the next space, the centerpiece is the large petri dish. So it is the, let's say, fungi garden that where everyone gets to experience these things live, and they do change every day. So depending on the day, and we started, we started to be make fun of by the curator and the guards. When are they going to escape? When are the fungi going to take over the room? When will they take over the rest of the Biennale? But it ended up, I have to say, being one of the projects that people were really responding to, and for us that was a huge pleasure. So we kind of managed to make them look beautiful for people. Again, there were problems because they developed their own little microclimates, and we had to clean them every second day, and hire 2 students from the university to what is it, when Mickey Mouse becomes a magician in training, that kind of thing. They had to become magicians in training to learn how to deal with the fungi as well. And then we also set up a display to explain to everyone how this had all come about. And now I will share a short video, which I think more than anything gives you an idea of what went on. And please let me know immediately, Angela, if you don't hear the sound, because I hope I've shared it correctly.
Okay.
So that's where we are right now. And, we're looking forward to our next adventure. We don't know exactly what that will be. Thank you very much for listening and watching.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. That was so intellectual, mind expanding. I'm sure there are lots of questions. Just really, really challenging and exciting. Somebody is out there doing good, I think is what I would say. Would Yvonne like to read some of the questions? Or Edward, I can see Edward is talking. Edward like to talk. Edward Beckman. Can you unmute?
So how's that?
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, thank you, Thomas. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. I must admit, I do empathise a great deal with you. I'm also a landscape architect, and I practice in Greece and in the UK. And I do understand exactly what you talked about when you said about people needing to sort of impose themselves on the landscape. And the thing I'm concerned about in Greece is everybody builds what they call tortas, these houses on top of hills, which ruin the landscape for everybody else. But worse than that, the wind turbines, which are all over the place in Greece and rapidly expanding. And I think what's interesting is that Greece is a signatory of the European Landscape Convention, but has not actually carried out any landscape character assessments, unlike the rest of Europe. So there are no really strongly protected landscapes. And I wondered whether your approach, which I think is absolutely admirable, should be adopted throughout much more of Greece, that people should not be allowed to just build the tortas, that they should have to blend their scheme in with the local landscape. And do you think it's possible to get Greece to follow that?
I think it's, can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. I think it's possible, and there are people doing it. There are people who've been trying to do it, and some of them are even in the audience tonight, and they've been trying much harder and much longer than we have. But it is an uphill battle, you realize, both because of, let's say, cultural unawareness of the importance of many of these landscapes, and because of economic and other interests that are afraid of the idea of protection. Protected things are things that can then not be exploited in a certain way of thinking, while in another way of thinking, protecting value is the only way you keep it there. If you don't protect it, you lose the value, so everyone loses in the end.
Do you think people recognize the value? I mean, some of the landscapes I've seen, 3,000-4,000 years old. You go to a place like the battlefield of Plataea, it's untouched virtually since the battle took place, which is incredible. And there are lots of places like that in Greece. Is it valued? I don't know.
Not enough, certainly. There is, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I have to say, maybe because we're architects, we're doing that bit of work, but maybe people who are better at writing, communicating through pictures, better with the media, maybe they will be more important in the end in changing people's minds.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, but I certainly think your approach is absolutely correct. I think that's wonderful. It looks great too.
Thank you. Harold, I'm going to just go ahead with the people who've got their hands raised, Yvonne. We'll get to the chat in a minute, if you don't mind. So Harold Hirschhofer.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm calling in from Italy. We have a garden in Elba. I have a question, Thomas, about water budgeting. I apologize, I joined late, so perhaps you covered it already. So if you did, I withdraw the question. When you have these large-scale hotel projects, do you prepare a water budget for your client, in the sense that how much water is needed? Because you showed pictures where there was a complete disaster. There was no green plant visible, and then it became beautifully green. But it takes a lot of water, I think, in a landscape where water is not abundant.
The answer is yes. It is in larger projects. It's also a legal obligation, because larger projects need to go through environmental permitting, and water is one of the things that are very sensitive and are looked at. There is currently an attempt, which is not landscape related. It's kind of a much bigger attempt to impose environmental permitting obligations on all scales of tourist projects, and I think that is the way to go, because it forces you to again deal with the totality of the problem, including the water. And I think, Harold, you are either Austrian or from the south of Germany, from your
You have a good hearing. I'm Austrian.
Okay, George Blunder has got his hand up.
Well, Angela, first I want to thank you for having Thomas talk to us. I think all of these have been really terrific. But Thomas, I just thought this was too amazing and too fantastic and too great. I've never heard a talk from anyone else connected with gardens or landscaping that's anything comparable to this. Really just terrific. So I'm going to ask you a question, and if you don't want to answer it or like me to withdraw it, let me know and I will withdraw it. But I'm just curious if you can give me and everyone else who's watching and listening any idea of how the cost compares. I mean, if I came to you and said I want a house and a garden someplace in Greece, I could also go to someone else who just do the ordinary kind of thing. And is your approach, I mean, somehow it seems like it must cost a bit more. So would you care to comment on that, or would you like me to withdraw this question?
No. I think it's a perfectly valid question, because, you know, whether we like it or not, the main thing that makes the world of humans go round is money. So, you know, we have to be aware of that. And thank you, George, for your very kind words. As you know, anyone who makes things knows that there's no greater pleasure than having, you know, someone say something nice about your work. It really, you know, makes my day. In terms of design cost and design fees, I would say we would charge about 3 times what the local nursery person would charge for design. But of course, the local nursery person is subsidizing their design because they're also selling the plants. I would say that, you know, we might be anywhere from twice as expensive to the same price as you know, competing landscape architects. In terms of implementation, it's a more interesting story, because you get you know, if you do everything perfectly, you remove the cost of the drip irrigation system, so you have lower initial capital expenditure. You have to get well-prepared plants, which you would need anyway, but let's say that increases your capital expenditure because, you know, you can't get around by getting cheaper plants. But then you have increased maintenance expenditure in the first years, because you need to do some hand irrigation and you need to be more careful with your maintenance. And you have decreased maintenance costs down the line, because gradually you just let the plants take off on their own. And we've been doing these budgeting exercises for clients, I have to say, and the answer is it's still a bit more expensive if you're looking at capital expenditure early on. But, you know, the longer you look, you know, the longer your time horizon, the more savings you get.
Okay, thank you. Caroline Norris and then Alexandra. Caroline first. Can you unmute, Caroline?
Minor detail. I just want to recommend a documentary film that some people may not have seen that's along the line of the fungi, and it's called Fantastic Fungi. It came out a few years ago, and I think it's available on Netflix right now. But the first half of the film is about the ecological benefits of all the mycorrhizae and underground fungi, which is fantastically presented. The second half isn't as related to this. It's really about the psychedelic benefits of using fungi, and it's interesting. But the first half is, I think, the part that actually would appeal to people here most of all. And it's presented with an animation, and the computer animation they create underground to depict this is phenomenal. It's really wonderful. I think it's on Netflix right now, but
okay.
I'm not going to swear to that. It's available for streaming.
Sounds fantastic.
And it's really inspiring.
Thanks. Alexandra?
Yes, Thomas, I wanted to ask, you showed some pictures of areas that were really disrupted by trucks and all the construction works. So how do you start rebuilding the soil when you approach your projects?
Okay. We have an advantage in those locations, which is that the plants are extremely well adapted to these soils. Not only are they adapted, but they want very alkaline, very poor soils. So what we do, oh, hi, Donald, I can even see you now. What we do is only putting a bit of soil amelioration per plant as it is being planted, and that is done also to avoid in the area that we don't want weeds, to avoid weed growth. But other than that, we do not do soil amendment.
So you just add something in the hole,
Yes.
hole of the plant.
Yeah.
Okay, and the rest remains. Do you use mulch at all, rock or what?
We use inorganic mulch, so pebble mulch. We have had problems with many, even though a lot of it looks similar. Some of it, a lot of it raises very high temperatures in the summer.
I can imagine.
And there are a few in the end that don't, and we end up using those. We don't use mulch most of the time. You know, if something needs to look refined from the beginning, we use mulch. Otherwise, we don't. Also, many of the areas are very steep, so mulch isn't really an option.
Do you have much erosion?
Erosion can be a problem, but it's usually in specific, you get these specific lines that don't look good. They don't look good, but they're actually a very minor bit of the overall land.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now Yvonne, darling, you've got to leave, I hear. Okay, do you want to do your questions? And then I've got Patti Stevens and Barbara Paul lined up.
Okay, just to say, well, thank you. There's been an avalanche of complimentary remarks on the chat, and even on behalf of the snakes, by the way. The snakes were here on the chat and said thank you so much for speaking up for us. And a lot of people were very tantalized by the idea of Dynasty having such an influence over domestic garden choices across the world. And of course, the horrible images of waste have stayed with a lot of us as well. But the fungi have been completely tantalizing. Everybody's remarking on the fungi, and one person is and Annemiek is pointing out that Suzanne Simard, if that's how you pronounce it, her name, is done most of some most important scientific research in fungi and the natural environment, and she points out that she discovered the phenomenon of the wood wide web. You know how trees talk to each other through the fungal networks between from one tree root system to another. So yes, the importance of fungi we're very keen on. One person is asking a very specific question, and that's Manos Bazanias. I apologize if I mispronounced his name. Would like to know if the same tenets of symbiotic design can work for gardens and projects in highly degraded and urbanized spaces, and for example, in the urban core of Athens and post-industrial wastelands. Should you try to restore the ecological functions and landscapes that have been lost and integrate local native species back in, or is it just a lost cause? Well, I don't know how you would like to tackle that sort of thing.
Can we give him a week?
No, I don't believe in lost causes. Is the simple answers.
Good.
So yes, and I'm not sure that when it comes to the center of the city, it's so much about restoring more than kind of rebuilding. Thinking of what it means for things to function ecologically in a city and how you can bring that about. But some simple examples are, give the trees very good rooting areas. Do things that help the soil be a living organism rather than dead stuff. And others, but these two I think are maybe the most important of all. Focus on the soil.
Okay. Any more, Yvonne? I think you're muted.
There's a lot of very clever, inspiring remarks about fungi and how they're taking over the world, and how, in fact, at your Biennale, it wasn't humans bringing the fungi together and mounting it. It was the fungi getting us to work for them in order that we can then go on and distribute their spore around the world. This is a fungus conspiracy that we have just been unwittingly involved in.
Oh, I think at this point we'll go to Patti Stevens. Thanks, Yvonne. See you. Okay, Patti.
Hello. Hi, Thomas. So I also came late to your presentation, so sorry if I'm unaware of some of the information you already said. But so I'm assuming you're from Greece. I mean, it seems like you have all this great knowledge of local plants and local culture. So I'm living in Rome, Italy. I'm a landscape designer, my architect husband, but I come from Oregon, in the West Coast of the United States. And so on my mind, I'm often wondering how people feel about, I was trained and taught in Oregon, and I've learned a lot since I've been here, but I'm kind of curious about your opinion about a designer's responsibility about being completely familiar with the local plants. Like maybe you've worked internationally. I imagine that people have sought you out internationally, but I'm curious about your opinion about working in cultures or landscapes that you're not as familiar with the plant palette or list.
Well, the answer is that philosophically speaking, I think we should all be, very serious and responsible about what we do, but we also need to give ourselves a break. We are just slightly more advanced apes. I'm sure that someone I believe that someone who is trained and has the right things in their mind and in their heart can do a good job almost everywhere, but that includes being extremely sensitive and respectful to the local plants, the local conditions, and the local people. So you have to be able to, be a sponge.
It's kind of like, back to your point, don't be blind. What is where you start, right?
And then, we also make mistakes, and they're part of learning. I think we have to be careful of the kinds of mistakes that then destroy whole ecosystems. Those are the ones to be very certain that we don't, go into.
Thank you.
Barbara?
Hi, thank you, Thomas. It's been absolutely fabulous. I have a question for you about, you painted the picture of how the gardens that you do, they evolve over time and they require less maintenance and they require less water as time goes on, which is what, as designers and landscapers, those are things we all try to do. But in your experience, Thomas, those wonderful projects that you showed us, how long does that evolution take? Is it 3 years, 5 years, 10 years before the garden sort of maintains itself?
To be absolutely frank, we still haven't gotten there. So we're getting closer.
Okay, because I'm curious as to how you, when you're talking with your clients about that goal that you're designing to get toward, how do you respond to them? Would say, well, how long will it take? Because I know they'll ask you that.
Yes, so we used to be able to kind of, we believed so much in what we were doing that we used to lie through our teeth much more successfully and say, you know, don't worry, it's going to be fine. Now we are more measured in our responses. And I have to say that it also results in more failures, more people saying, well, you know, I don't think I'll go that way. But the people who go that way go with you know, open eyes. And
Okay, thank you.
That's honest. Well, an hour and a half in, I think, you know, I think we can all go and have something to eat possibly. But I'm sure that everyone will join me and say, this has been absolutely one of the best talks that we've ever had. Thank you again for taking time to share with us your vision, your philosophy. It's really, really thought-provoking and will definitely change the way we go around, for sure.
thank you. It's a huge honor and a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks to
Thank you,
everyone.
Thoma. Thank you very much. And I hope we meet in Athens.
Thank you.
Thank you
very
Don.
much.
Thank you, Thoma.
Thank you.
Thank
We
you.
could carry on the conversation, Thoma, perhaps in Athens sometime.
With great pleasure.
That would be nice.
Thomas,
Great
can you hear
pleasure.
me? I'm wondering, are you by any chance a nephew of that wonderful person called Doxiadis?
Yes.
Oh, I'm not surprised. Thank you.
Fine. Okay, so everyone, see you next month, I hope. Thank you for being with us and have a great evening. Thank you again, Thomas.
Thank you to
Bye.
everybody.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thomas.
Thank you.
Thank you.